fortitude.org. And with that, I will hand it over to Jeffrey. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Historic District Council for inviting me to do this presentation. This is a book about the Brooklyn Bridge that was several years in the making and that I am very proud of, and offered me, I think, a unique opportunity to pull together a variety of images, over 250 images of the bridge as it was being built. And so I will now share with you my screen and the slideshow which follows. And so there we go. So building the Brooklyn Bridge, 1869 to 1883 were the years of construction, and it illustrated history with images in 3D. And so we'll get to those shortly and discussing the 3D images. Here is the cover of the book. This is a photograph dating from the 1870s. Let's get oriented. And so I'm sure as a primarily New York audience, you're fully familiar with the Brooklyn Bridge and where it is, but just in case, we see New Jersey in this print on the left, we see Manhattan in the middle, and then we see the Brooklyn Bridge stretching across the East River between what was then the city of New York in 1883 and the city of Brooklyn. And so Manhattan, New York City was the largest city in America, and Brooklyn was the third largest. And much of this had to do with the idea in the 1860s and 70s that New York City was filled up, that it had no place to grow. They did not have a concept at that point that the city could go up. And so Brooklyn had land. It's roughly 4 times the size of Manhattan, acreage-wise, and had land, particularly as you see at top right, undeveloped areas. And so people could live in Brooklyn, and if there were a reliable means of getting across the East River, they could commute to Manhattan. And so that was much of the allure of the Brooklyn Bridge. And so it quickly became a phenomenon. This is a token that was issued in 1889, just 6 years after the bridge opened, to commemorate 100 years after George Washington's inauguration. And so on the other side of this token is George Washington, and on this side is the New York and Brooklyn Bridge. Progress of 100 years, the bridge as a great symbol of progress and dubbed the 8th wonder of the world. So quickly caught on, and to the extent that all sorts of companies wanted to be associated with the bridge. Here's a cotton spool company, and you can see how they have incorporated into their advertising spools at the top of the tower and on the cables of the bridge. And of course, the great piece, the great work about the Brooklyn Bridge is David McCullough's The Great Bridge, which I have read several times and I've listened to on audio many, many times. Is a great account of the building of the bridge, and by my favorite historian, but certainly does not have the number or quality of images that appear in my book. And so this is also a human drama, the story of the bridge. John A. Roebling, the genius really behind the planning of the bridge, who got himself killed in the earliest days of the planning and construction of the bridge. And so more on that shortly. And his son, Washington Roebling, who took over as the chief engineer at the tender age of 32 years. And then Emily Roebling, Washington's wife, who played a key role in the construction of the bridge and for whom a part of Brooklyn Bridge Park, as many of you know, is now named. And so here again, the book and the table of contents of the book. And so I was fortunate to have Richard Hall, who is the biographer of John Roebling, the father, write an introduction, Building the Brooklyn Bridge, one image at a time. And Erica Wagner, who is the biographer of Washington Roebling, writing a piece called The Brooklyn Bridge, A Love Story, and how she, as a teenager, stood on the bridge for the first time and decided she was very much in love. And so you see the layout of the book in terms of the chapters, the engineers, the workers, and then the various stages of construction through opening day. And so here we will track the chapters. The first chapter is the engineers. And so to give you kind of a big picture, the book pulls together lantern slides from the 19th century as the bridge was being built, stereo views from my own collection and from two other extraordinary collections, archival material from the Municipal Archives, the Museum of the City of New York, and RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where Washington Roebling donated his papers. And so really, I think visually, as well as in the text, tells the remarkable story of the construction of the beloved Brooklyn Bridge. And so here we see the two chief engineers in sequence, John A. Roebling and Washington Roebling, and John A. Roebling. So Roebling is a fascinating fellow, trained in Germany as an engineer, studied philosophy with Hegel, according to one account, was Hegel's favorite student, was known for his fierce eyes. Look at the eyes in this photograph. He was a man who loved to work, who loved to invent, who loved to take on a challenge and overcome it. He was not known for his sense of humor. He was not known to be someone who planned his vacations. As I said, loved to work. And so he decided that Germany had very little future for him, that there was just too much bureaucracy there to accomplish anything. And so he put together a group of people to leave Germany. And he decided he was going to go to Pennsylvania. He and his brother bought 6,000 acres of land near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he declared himself a farmer. And for a year, he was a farmer, and then he decided that farming was not sufficiently intellectually challenging for him, and he went into the wire rope manufacturing business in this tiny little town of Saxonburg that he and his brother had founded. He had read in a European journal about wire rope as a replacement for hemp ropes and started making these ropes in this tiny little town. Farmers would come in to help with the work. And he became, ultimately, Roebling and Sons became the largest manufacturers of wire rope for electricity, for telegraphs, for elevators, for all sorts of things. And he also became the leading suspension bridge builder in the world. And so there were other suspension bridge builders, most of whom had their bridges at some point or other collapse. None of his bridges ever collapsed. And he really pioneered the idea of a suspension bridge, which we'll discuss shortly as to exactly what a suspension bridge is. Here is an advertisement for the company that he founded and wound up moving from Saxonburg in Pennsylvania to Trenton in New Jersey and set up there. And then after his death and into the 20th century, 1905, 1906, set up a town, a company town of Roebling, New Jersey, which still exists. And so here is Washington Roebling, the son, who is a fascinating figure. He went to RPI and graduated in engineering. If you wanted to study engineering In this period, the mid-19th century, you either went to West Point to become a military engineer or RPI as a civil engineer. He was an experienced bridge builder to the extent that his idea of how he spent his summer vacation during college was to help his father build a suspension bridge. He was also a Civil War veteran. He had enlisted very early in the Civil War as a private, which was the lowest rank possible. And he rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, was tremendously respected, played key roles in the Civil War. And he was also very much the chief engineer in waiting. So he had, as I said, trained with his father, and he was second in America and probably in the world in terms of who should be building the Brooklyn Bridge. So he's 32 when he takes over. Oops. So crossing the East River. Why is crossing the East River such a big deal? And so we go back to 1750, and here we are with Brooklyn in the foreground and Manhattan in the distance. And the East River is, of course, a tidal estuary, not actually a river. And so the tides come in, salt water back and forth, makes it particularly difficult to build a bridge with piers in the water, towers in the water. But this was an important crossing point for Long Island farmers who wanted to bring their produce to market in Manhattan. And it was also the Pierponts had set up Brooklyn Heights as a commuter area. And so the idea that you could take the ferries across. And so there were 5 or so ferries that were running, the Hamilton Avenue Ferry and the Fulton Ferry, et cetera, and get across. But of course, there were problems with the ferries. First of all, the ferries were running even before Fulton and his steam engines. So here we see horse-powered ferries, horse walking on or running, trotting on a treadmill and supplying the power. But then the problem was that the East River, particularly in the 19th century, before there was any element of climate change and global warming, the East River would freeze solid. And people, if they wanted to get to work from Brooklyn, would start walking across the ice. And then there was, of course, the danger that the ice would break up. And so there was really a need for something that was much more reliable. And the solution was a suspension bridge. And so here we see the Great Suspension Bridges of the United States, 1879, Scientific American, showing 4 suspension bridges. The first, the second, the third, and the fourth of these bridges are all by the Roeblings. And so this gives you an idea of how important they were in the suspension bridge construction business in America. So their first project was the Niagara Bridge, 1851 to 1855 across the Niagara Gorge. It was a 2-tiered bridge. And so on the top tier, you see a steam locomotive. And the locomotives could very slowly, about 5 miles an hour, pull trains across. And then there was a second tier. Oops. And so you can see it at the edge here. And that was for carriages and for pedestrians. So what we're looking at now is a stereoscopic view or stereo view, side-by-side images pasted to a card about 3.5 inches by 7 inches. And with a viewer, you could see these images and trick your brain into believing that you were seeing in 3D. And these were tremendously popular in the 19th century. I have a collection, or had a collection, of almost 5,000 different images, primarily of New York City, that I have donated to the Greenwood Historic Fund. And these really are a wonderful source for seeing what 19th century America, and actually the world, you could travel the world from your Victorian parlor with these. And so here we are, our first anaglyph. So this is an image that is obtained from these stereo views and merged by software, free software that's available online. And so those of you who have your 3D glasses, if you take them out now and make sure that the red lens is over your left eye and kind of experiment with what distance you want to be from that to get the best 3D effect, you should get a feel that you're seeing the Niagara Bridge in 3 dimensions. And so I will tell you as we go through, here's another 3D image. So there are 44 3D images in the book, which certainly is a wonderful feature of it, I think. And this is showing the 2 tiers, showing the American Falls in the distance. Oops. American Falls in the distance there, and the Canadian Falls at the right up the river. And so we are also in 3D here. Now we're back in 2D. So you can take your glasses off. Allegheny Bridge, Pittsburgh, 1857 to 59 by the Roeblings. And so each of these bridges, they kind of refined their technique. They made them a little bit longer if they could. And so here we see the Cincinnati Covington Bridge, which was started in 1856. Construction was interrupted by the Civil War, and it was concluded in 1866. Anyone with a familiarity or in your mind's eye an understanding of the Brooklyn Bridge, I think this very much feels like it, with the granite towers, with the cables, but on a smaller scale. And so the Brooklyn Bridge would turn out to be substantially larger than this, would have 4 cables to support the deck, and would have 2 arches in its construction. So here we are, a Currier and Ives print of the Brooklyn Bridge, the Great East River Bridge. It was known by a number of names. And we see here the essentials of a suspension bridge. And so first we see the towers, which elevate the deck of the bridge sufficiently high to allow navigation to continue on the East River. Of course, the Navy Yard is above where the Brooklyn Bridge would be built. The United States Navy was concerned that they'd be able to get their ships underneath it, but this was also a navigable waterway, and so you had to get all these steamboats and masted ships through here. And so the towers allow the bridge to be high enough to continue navigation along the East River. You also see the cables here, and so 4 cables on the Brooklyn Bridge. The cables are what support the suspenders, and the suspenders are wires that hang straight down from the cables and then connect to the beams, the steel beams that support the deck of the bridge. And then you also see additional wires at an angle coming off the tower for extra strength. So as early as 1857, John Roebling is submitting plans for a bridge across the East River, but this was to go much closer to where the Queensboro Bridge is now, across what was then Blackwell's, now Roosevelt Island. This was never built. And here we see the ferry terminal on the Brooklyn side. And so the very distinctive mansard roof of the Fulton Ferry Terminal. We see the Brooklyn Tower of the Brooklyn Bridge at left, and we see 2 of the ferry slips. And so in June of 1869, John Roebling, having been named the chief engineer of the bridge, and Washington Roebling, his assistant, and another assistant engineer, went down to this area to figure out where the center line of the bridge would be located and to place it. And as they were working, John Roebling was on the piles. And so here we see the Hamilton ferry slip, and you see these wooden piles coming up out of the water. And these had some movement to them, which would kind of cushion the ferry as it came into the slip. And John Roebling was on these stringers along the ferry slip and thought he had moved out of the way of the ferry that was coming in, but it turned out he had not. And in fact, his leg got crushed between that ferry and the slip. And his toes were amputated on that foot. And he was, as you might imagine, a very strong and opinionated man. And so he's instructing the doctors on how to treat him. He believes strongly in water treatment. And so he is rinsing that foot and soaking that foot, but he gets lockjaw, tetanus, and he dies within just a matter of weeks in Brooklyn. And so his son takes over. The ferry killed John A. Roebling. This is his grave in Trenton. And Washington Roebling, 32 years old, takes over the construction of the bridge, living in Brooklyn Heights. He unfortunately gets the bends, which a number of the workers got. They were using compressed air in the caissons, and we'll get to the caissons shortly. And then coming out of that compressed air and not decompressing slowly, which you need to do. And so he got the bends, but he also really exhausted himself, throwing himself into the work, and had what we would describe today as a nervous breakdown, and could not go out to the bridge. And so during the 14 years of bridge construction, Washington Roebling never set foot on the bridge, which is just extraordinary. He had vision problems. He had tremendous pain in his joints, but he monitored the construction actually with the telescope rather than the binoculars that are shown here. And his wife became the liaison to the workers on the bridge. So some of the just wonderful photographs. This is 1872, the staff leading the construction of the bridge. And so we see here that each of these individuals, or most of these individuals, are numbered to tell us exactly who is who. And here's another photograph from 6 years later, 1878, showing the trustees at the left in suits, and the assistant engineers and draftsmen at right. And then we see two of the assistant engineers in the foreground. So the one at left with the bow tie, who is looking at the camera, is William Payne, who had served with Washington Roebling during the Civil War. And just tremendous courage. They had changed out of their uniforms to go ride across the Virginia countryside, making maps of what they were seeing and risking immediate execution as spies had they been captured. So Payne was one of the assistant engineers, as was George McNulty, who is leaning on his left elbow and has that top hat on. And McNulty was a graduate of the University of Virginia. At the age of 21, he applied to be an engineer, an assistant engineer on the bridge. He was rejected. He then volunteered to work with no wages. And Washington Roebling was so impressed that he hired McNulty. McNulty loved Washington Roebling. He named one of his sons Washington McNulty. And so there were 6 assistant engineers. One had been hired on a 30-day contract. Each of the 6 worked the entire 14 years until the bridge was completed. So here is Colonel Payne, his gravestone at Greenwood Cemetery. And here is McNulty, a gravestone that I placed at his grave as part of our unmarked grave project, Brooklyn Bridge assistant engineer. So the workers, we do fortunately have some extraordinary photographs of the workers on the site. pausing to be photographed. And so this is one of my favorite photographs for the number of workers and for the construction of the photograph itself and the sharpness of the detail. And so some more of the workers from that same photograph. So the workers were many immigrant workers from Germany, from Italy, from Ireland, many Civil War veterans, and many men who had experience at sea, being up in mass up high. And that was a skill or a comfort that was important to the bridge construction. So here we see these barrels in the foreground. This is a half stereo view by a photographer who really understood the idea of 3D photography. And so something in the foreground, something in the midground, and one of the towers in the distance. And so here you should be able, with your glasses on, to really see the 3D effect of these barrels. And if you kind of rock from side to side, you should see those barrels kind of move with you also, and the perspective change. So here's another one of the vaults of the approach to the bridge being built. And here we are in 3D, seeing these workers on their deck there, putting the bricks in place. So here we are, the caissons. The caissons were the first element of the construction of the bridge, 1870 to 1872. These were just huge wooden boxes, timbers, sticks, 12 inches by 12 inches. The caisson from left to right here, 168 feet, 102 feet deep. David McCullough calculated that you could have put 4 tennis courts on the top of this. So the men on the top here give you some idea of the scale of this. This would then be floated down the East River, built in Greenpoint, the first one, and then for the Brooklyn Tower, and then for the New York Tower, built on East 6th Street in Manhattan, floated down and into position. And then they started to dig down. So workers went into the caisson and worked inside the caisson as the caisson, with granite piled on top of it and limestone for the tower to force it down into the ground. So this became the largest thing that had ever been dug into the ground up until that point, and it remains below the tower of the Brooklyn Bridge. Before starting to dig, the engineers, of course, wanted to know what they were going to be encountering, so they took boring samples. And here is a wonderful drawing from the municipal archives. And here's details. So they were going to hit small boulders and sand, then a layer of sand with much clay, et cetera, et cetera. So here we are launching one of the caissons. It was built in a shipyard. There was no place to build a caisson specifically. And so built in the shipyard and then launched. And here is Eckford Webb, the shipbuilder, Webb and Bell, his grave at Greenwood. Very unusual in that it is a granite carving, granite, a very dense, hard material that was not easily carved. And the back of this monument, his proudest accomplishment, lived from 1825 to 1893, an eminent shipbuilder and constructor of the caissons for the first Brooklyn suspension bridge. So his proudest accomplishments, this is a man who had built some of the largest ships on the sea, and yet he was most proud of his work on the caissons for the Brooklyn Bridge. So here is the caisson in operation. It's a somewhat complex thing, but you can see the workers at the bottom. They are digging out rock, debris, and mud, and soil, and gravel, and whatever is down there, allowing the caisson to proceed down into the ground. And as they're doing it, you can see atop the caisson the granite stones, limestone first and then granite. You also see these clamshell buckets that were sent down to pull the debris out through water. The water was there to keep the compressed air inside the caisson. And then they had locks that allowed the workers to go in and out. And so here are some of the wonderful drawings of the original drawings of the bridge, and a more complex drawing by Washington Roebling as he was dealing with the issues of what would go in and what would go out. And here we see a foundation of the New York Tower. So here in the distance, you see here the Brooklyn Tower, which went up first. You see that mansard roof of the Fulton Ferry. And so the Brooklyn Tower was farther along. It was the first one started. And so you can always tell which direction you're going in here. And you see some writing here. So this writing on the left side says air compressor house with an arrow, and then winter. And so we actually do see some snow on the ground. We see these stones at the far right stacked on a barge, ready to be brought over and made a part of the tower. And so here is a closer look at that handwriting air compressor house. Erica Wagner, who, as I mentioned, is the biographer of Washington Roebling. She tells me that this is Washington Roebling's handwriting. And so it also says winter. Here's the airlock. So the book, again, combines photographs, combines original drawings, and also combines illustrations, woodcuts from newspapers of the time. And so they did not have the technology as the bridge was being built to reproduce photographs. And so they took a photograph and then, or a drawing, and then reproduced it as a woodcut. So here they are breaking up boulders, moving debris, and then the water shaft at the bottom and its pool where they put the debris that the workers had dug out, had to mix that debris so it didn't harden, and had to keep water running on it to keep it liquid so that the clamshell could come down and grab it. So again, original drawings, wonderful, I think, graphic design. Here we see two of the clamshell buckets. So here's one here and one over here at the far left. And they're dipping down to pull the debris out. And you see this fellow here. I did have a engineer consulting on this, and he told me that that fellow seated on a board is in fact there to wave to the steam engine operator who is controlling the height of this clamshell bucket. So the bucket goes up and down through this shaft, and he's just telling him when it has reached its bottom and he should stop lowering it. The clamshells emptying into a small cart, and the debris would then be dumped into the river and then dredged out of the river. So here we are, the towers of the bridge. Again, we're looking from Manhattan to Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Tower more advanced. And an original drawing by John Roebling of the tower. I think that the towers are key to the bridge and our love of the bridge, the permanence and stability that the granite towers offer as opposed to the steel towers of the Williamsburg Bridge or the Manhattan Bridge or even the George Washington Bridge. And so this was clearly influenced by John Roebling, having grown up in Mulhausen, Germany, in a city or a town surrounded by a wall, a stone wall. And so he wanted these to be grand entrances to the first and third largest cities in America. And just a great detail, you see this woman with her parasol, just drawn in perhaps for scale or perhaps a little bit whimsically. The drawing from Washington Roebling looking from the top of the tower down, and you see these voids here, here, and here, and here, and here. And so the tower, in fact, is not solid stone. It is was unnecessary, he felt, and I guess he got that right. So, so here we're looking at one of the wonderful images of the skyline, such as it was of Manhattan in the 1870s, with the Brooklyn Tower up above most of the buildings. Again, we're in 3D here, so if you do have 3D glasses, these are 3 beauty shots that we have coming up. So a sailboat going by with the Tribune building and the United States Post Office at left. And then a very nicely constructed image of one of the towers. And then a very nicely framed image looking from the Brooklyn Tower across to the Manhattan Tower. Okay, so we're back in 2D now, no glasses necessary, looking down from the Brooklyn Tower at Brooklyn, and you see how low Brooklyn was, and it was, of course, known as the city of churches. And so at top left, you're seeing a number of church steeples. The anchorages were these massive piles of granite that had to hold the ends of the cables. And so they were built up, and this shows you the anchor chain, and at the bottom, the anchor plate that held was connected up at top right to the cables and held them in place. So here we see all these derricks are atop the anchorage as it's being built, and you see the relationship between the anchorage where the end of the cable is attached, oops, and the cable goes up and over and then dips down between the towers and then comes down again to the anchorage on the other side, on the Brooklyn side. So here are the anchor plates, and here are the anchor plates in 3D with your glasses if you'd like. And the anchor bars, these are bars coming out and up from the anchor plates. And here we are again in 3D. Okay, so now back to woodcuts, the footbridge and the cradles. The footbridge was a temporary construction. It's what these men are walking on, and it allowed them to get to the cradles, which are the horizontal pieces, and from which they could monitor the cables as they were being spun. And so here you see the 3 cables, and then there were 2 more to either side to allow the worker access. And here is one of the workers, and this gives you some idea of the precarious nature of some of the work. This guy is up on a cradle. He's got a flag in his right hand to signal to his coworkers if one of the wires is not sufficiently taut or is too taut. And he's also holding on to the cable with his left hand. So here we are, come one, come all. You see the men there standing on the footbridge with the anchor bars in the foreground. You do not see a security guard here. You do not see a gate. And so people could come up here and could walk across the footbridge from Brooklyn to New York or vice versa. And so here we are in 3D again. You put your glasses on. This is a beautiful, beautifully constructed image. You see a note from Washington Roebling, safe for only 25 men at one time. And here we're looking down from the Brooklyn Tower towards the Brooklyn anchorage. And here we're looking, so again in 3D, you see the slats of the footbridge. And so they were separated so that the wind could blow through them and not hopefully swing them back and forth. Now we're back in a woodcut without the 3D glasses. And you see regrets, I've had a few. The idea that people went up there and then decided that they had made a big mistake, that they were 150 or 200 feet above the water, and if they looked down, it was not a good thing. According to one of the veteran workers, women seem to be doing better up at this height than men did. So the cables themselves had to be spun. Here are some workers working on the cables. And here is the master mechanic demonstrating the first wire across and how it could be relied upon by the workers. And essentially, you're dealing with clothesline technology, a traveler. You're attaching a wire to a wire and then pulling it across. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And so the cables themselves are 13,000 miles of wire. Each wire is about the thickness of a pencil. And so there's a lot of wires in those cables, and the original cables are still there. So this is some of the technology that they used. Each of the wires was only 800 feet long, and so they had to do a lot of splicing, and they came up with this rather ingenious device to do that splicing. So here's the wire shed that we see atop the Brooklyn anchorage. And here we're looking down and seeing the same shed on the anchorage there. And here we see the 8 wheels of wire. Each cable had 2 wheels of wire devoted to it. And they were, of course, always replenishing that. Some of the great drawings by Washington Roebling. And so he was playing with the idea of each strand of a cable. There were 19 strands per cable, and each strand was about 250 wires. And so he was playing with the idea of how do you arrange the strands. And so his father had never built a bridge with this many strands, this many wires, and you can see he's kind of changing his mind where strand number 14 that's placed in will go. This is one of my favorite photographs. This is one I own, a lantern slide. So a glass slide looking towards Manhattan with City Hall Park would have been just in the distance here, Park Road to the left. And you see the 4 cables. And so you see one cable at the left that has been bracketed, and this one also, but then these, you see the strands still separate. So the progress of the bridge. Here is atop the bridge tower, and you see the cable, one of the cables at left, and then you see the guy wires at right. So, and here in 3D. So again, if you have your glasses handy, you should be able to see that pretty well. They wrapped the cables, worked through the winter, wrapped it in galvanized zinc to protect them from the salty sea air, which really have done a tremendous job in protecting the cables. Here's the deck of the bridge as it was being constructed. And so they were doing these phenomenal drawings. Assistant engineer Wilhelm Hildenbrand was particularly adept as a draftsman. And here's another 3D image, an anaglyph showing the approach to the bridge. And so the approach, the idea was that you needed to get both people and trains and horses up onto the bridge, and it had to be a gradual enough incline. And so that's why the bridge is more than a mile long from end to end. Construction, they moved granite around with a railway. And so we see one of the cars here, and we see here this with a payload below it to move the granite stones. The deck of the bridge is suspended superstructure, showing you how they're using steel beams hanging from these suspender wires that are attached to the cables to extend out from each of the towers to meet in the middle of the deck of the bridge. So here we are attaching the suspenders to the steel beams and showing you the steel beams. The bridge is 85 feet wide. And it had 5 sections. So it had one way in each of the 2 directions for carriages for herds of cattle and sheep and hogs. And then it had a railway from end to end. And then it had an elevated pedestrian area. So this shows you the bridge in operation. And here we are, the railways and terminals. They didn't want to use steam engines, too heavy. And so William Payne, the assistant engineer, was a pioneer of cable cars. He had built the cable car system on Sutter in San Francisco and in Denver and Cleveland. And so they had a steam engine on the Brooklyn side, which pulled the cables from terminal to terminal. They built these very elaborate terminals at either end of the bridge. Here's an original drawing. And the Brooklyn terminal. And inside the Brooklyn terminal and the construction. And here, let's see if we can get this working. So this is a movie from 1899 showing where on the front of one of the cable cars, you see between the rails here, the cable would have been. And then you see trolleys also. So they had converted one of the outside lanes to trolleys to increase the mass transit aspect of the bridge. And by the mid 20th century, when the automobile was ascendant, they eliminated those trolleys and eliminated the cable cars and created 3 lanes for automobiles. And now with the bicycle ascendant in New York City, they have taken one of the car lanes out as of September of last year and put in a bicycle lane, which to me is wonderful because they have taken the bicycles off of the elevated pedestrian promenade. And so here we are, opening day, May 24th, 1883, after 14 years of construction. Great celebration. The President of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, Seth Low, the mayor of Brooklyn, greets the president. The signalman at left signals to the North Atlantic ships to fire a salute. Governor's Island fires, Naval Yard fire, and then a union of hearts, a union of hands. The cities are joined, great display of fireworks. And the Brooklyn Bridge is much beloved today. And so if you want to advertise the Knicks versus the Nets, you do so with the tower of the Brooklyn Bridge behind them. And here is the bridge in all its glory today. And so once again, my book, the cover, and I just wanted to, let's see if I can read this from Kurt Anderson, which I'm very proud of. If you love Brooklyn or bridges or New York City or cities or 19th century marvels or all of the above, as I do, building the Brooklyn Bridge is a perfect feast, a would-be time traveler's delight, overflowing with rare and evocative and fascinating images. It's a terrific book. And so the book is available online. The Greenwood Cemetery has it for sale. They have signed copies if you'd like. And you can get it at your local bookstore. And so I do hope you will support it. And let me just conclude with this from Montgomery Schuyler. Montgomery Schuyler was a critic with the Harper's Weekly. And so the day the bridge opened, he wrote, "It so happens that the work which is likely to be our most durable monument and to convey some knowledge of us to the most remote posterity is a work of bare utility, not a shrine, not a fortress, not a palace, but a bridge." And so I think that pretty much sums it up. And certainly if you have any questions for me, I'll be happy to entertain those.
Thank you so much. That was so fun. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat. We have someone asking if all of the bridges still exist, all of Roebling's bridges.
Oh, no. So the obviously the Brooklyn Bridge, but the Cincinnati Covington Bridge across the Ohio River still exists. It has been modified and kind of redone. And so 2 cables were added to it. It was redone by one of the assistant engineers on the Brooklyn Bridge in the latter part of the 19th century. And so that's still there. And there is a bridge that was originally built as an aqueduct for a canal. And so John Roebling kind of cut his teeth on those aqueducts, which allowed water to go across a river or whatever, or a gorge. And that bridge still exists. I believe it's near New Paltz, New York, and has since been converted into a automobile bridge. But beyond that, the other bridges, Niagara and Allegheny, are no longer with us.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Let me just, while we're waiting for a question to come in, I realize that the slideshows can get a little finicky on Zoom, and my Emily Roebling slide seems to have disappeared into Zoom land. And so I just wanted to say, in terms of her contribution to the bridge, that she had never studied to be an engineer, but she was very interested in science and mathematics, and became very, very conversant based on briefings, essentially, from Washington Roebling with the bridge. And she would go out 2-3 times a day from where they were living on Brooklyn Heights to convey messages to the assistant engineers. And I think it is doubtful if she had not stepped in the way she did, that the bridge would have been built. She was just tremendously admired by the trustees, by the workers. She was honored with being the first person to lead a delegation across the bridge as it was still being built, and to also ride across the bridge in a carriage. And she held aloft a rooster as a symbol of triumph at the insistence of her husband, Washington Roebling.
Did she ever assist in any other bridges?
No, he pretty much, they both got out of the bridge business after the Brooklyn Bridge. It had been so taxing on both of them. She went to law school, New York University Law School, which I also attended and graduated from. And so she graduated from NYU and lived into the early 20th century, died about 1903, I think it was. Washington Roebling, who had been this extraordinarily debilitated physically and emotionally, outlived virtually everyone who had worked on the bridge, and died at a ripe old age in 1926.
That is very interesting. I did not realize that she went to law school. Did she actually practice at all?
I'm not sure that she did. You know, McCullough talks about her as a leader of society, that when she went out for a carriage ride, the carriage driver sat behind her, and she's the one who drove the carriage, that she designed a mansion in Trenton for herself and her husband. And so she was, a woman of accomplishment, but I don't know that she ever practiced law.
So interesting. A lady who drives her own carriage.
Yes. Very un-19th century.
Well, I don't see any other questions, and we are after 6 now. So thank you very much. This was great. Very much enjoyed it.
Okay, well, thank you again, Michelle, and thank you to everyone who joined us this evening, and hopefully go buy our book. Thank you. Good night now.
Have a good night.